Sunday, April 23rd, 2023, Maneco 64, home of alternative economics and contrarian views. We're going to look at Lebanon today and see what we can learn from their banking and currency collapse of the last 3.5 years. And I've covered Lebanon before here on the channel. I've got a Lebanon hyperinflationary collapse playlist that I've just created. Before I start, though, I like to say I'm not saying that this is what's going to happen here in the UK, in the US, or in Europe, but I think there's a big probability that it could happen, and actually it's not the end of the world if we go the way of Beirut in Lebanon, and you will see why. You'll see what I mean. So yeah, most people think of Lebanon as a basket case. Yes, they had a civil war for about 15 years, I think, from 1975 to 1990. But recently, up until 2019, their currency had been very stable. It was pegged to the dollar at about 1,500 liras, Lebanese lira, excuse me, or Lebanese pounds. And believe it or not, and I interviewed Ali Chahadi from Beirut about a year ago, and he was telling me that Beirut, the interesting thing about Lebanon and Beirut is that there's so many banks, like tourists, when they come to Beirut, he told me, they're always surprised. And he said there's just as many banks as there are Starbucks in the US. And basically because Beirut has a history of being called the Switzerland of the Middle East. And if you don't believe me, or Lebanon, here's a story. Lebanon from Switzerland of the Middle East to modern day dystopia. Yes, they had a very strict banking secrecy laws, and Beirut was a center of banking for the very wealthy, the elites from the Middle East. It was also a center for entertainment. They weren't as conservative as the other countries around that area. Yes, it's a very interesting place. When we hear about Beirut in the mainstream media, it's about bombs and protests, of course, but look at the shops they have in Beirut. You just have to go on Google Map and have a look. So banking in Beirut or in Lebanon, and that's what I wanted to focus on. And because it's something that's kind of evolved here as well in the West in terms of its importance. It's very important now. The whole economy of the West has become financialized. Central banks are like very important. A lot of people talk about central banks, especially here in the UK. The City of London is supreme. And the same thing was true in Lebanon up until around October 2019, and I'll tell you why October 2019. So here you go. I spoke about this in one of my videos about Lebanon before. Lebanon's once lauded bankers under fire as economic crisis deepens. Bank branches are barricaded and the executives are anxious not to be seen in public. So this is from July 2020, and I made this video around that time. And I said that I think the same thing would happen here in the West, in the UK and in the US. And lo and behold, of course, we've seen bank failures this year. So am I saying we're going to go with the way of Lebanon and their currency collapse, their hyperinflation? We're going to come to that in a minute. No, but it seems to be evolving. The other thing I wanted to show you is I showed this article as well in my first video about Lebanon. I think that was around July 2020. And I spoke a lot about commodities at the time. We are only seeing gold and silver take off. And my question was whether that was going to translate into other commodities going up. And they have, of course, since 2020. And we're seeing a lot of inflation now in the West. And I said we could get the inflation that Lebanon is getting. But the other thing that I noted, and at the time, it was quite amazing to see this. IMF reports 49 billion losses at Lebanon's central bank as bailout talks drag. So at the time, this was like, wow, big news. They're losing 49 billion. How can central banks lose money? And I said in that video as well, it's going to happen here as well. And it has, mainly because interest rates have gone up and all the portfolios of the central banks are showing big losses. The FT, of course, here, for this article from February this year, doesn't seem to think it really matters. They even make fun of it. Does it matter that central banks are losing squillions? Well, and they even put a picture of Jay Powell printing the money. They're making fun about it. But the losses are much bigger in nominal terms than Lebanon. The Lebanese loss there was like 91% of GDP. We're not to those levels yet. But as you can see here, the Fed had lost about $1.3 trillion as of September last year. You can see here. And it's not just the Fed. If you go down here, it talks about the other central banks. The Fed is not unique, however. All major central banks have hemorrhaged enormous mark-to-market losses over the past year. The Swiss National Bank is sitting on paper losses of 143 billion. The Bank of England, England's whole is $200 billion. At the Bank of Canada is 26 billion. And some estimate the ECB's losses at around 800 billion. So they don't seem to think it matters because they say here at the end, in other words, the Fed's mission is to maximize employment, safeguard price stability. Well, they haven't been able to safeguard price stability, and whether they'll be able to maximize employment, I'm not too sure. If that entails the central bank buying a truckload of bonds right before a generational sell-off, losing $1 trillion or so in the process, so be it. So they're very flippant about that. I think the same thing's happening here. The money is also going abroad, and you might say, where? Well, offshore and into hard assets. And that's why in Lebanon, for about 20 years, up until October 2019, and I think it was September 2019. I think the date is September 13th. That's what Ali Chahadi told me. Up until then, dollars and Lebanese lira were exchanged just like they were the same because the rate was fixed, and but all of a sudden something changed. And people wanted their dollars actually. And actually what the banks did, they closed. They limited the amount of dollars you could take out. And why is that? Well, because all the dollars were siphoned by the elites, by the banking elites. And people were left holding the bag, left holding the Lebanese lira. And I think when I interviewed Ali Chahadi, the official rate was still 1,505 or something like that. But he was telling me that with $1 you could fetch 22,000 lira at the time. And one thing that he told me that was really hit home, and I wasn't surprised about, and I warned the viewers in that interview and subsequently, is that he told me he had 100 million Lebanese pounds or liras in his savings, and prior to October 2019, that was worth about $66,000, $70,000. So I didn't ask him what he did with that. Hopefully he was able to exchange that, a lot of that into dollars, but I don't think he was. But right now, we are told that the dollar fetches 15,000 Lebanese pounds, which is 10 times what it was fixed at for 20 years. So that fixed exchange rate was nothing but a mirage, and eventually it just collapsed, right? But that's not the real rate. You have to go, if you really want to see where the currency is, it's the black market, the parallel market. So this is a story from the 14th of March. Lebanon's currency value plunges to 100,000 against the dollar. So what am I trying to say here? Well, if what happened in Lebanon and Beirut happens in the West, and I think we're going this way, is it going to happen overnight? As we saw in Beirut, Lebanon, it happened overnight in September, October 2019. It was very sudden. Yes, if you're holding dollars or pounds or euros, they're going to become worthless. And what kind of currency or money is that going to be devalue against? Well, it's going to be gold and silver. And that's why I keep going on about gold and silver, how it's important to have some. And this is not advice, but it's what I've been doing, acquiring physical gold and silver. I think silver will become the day-to-day currency or cash. Gold will be more for safeguarding your wealth. If you've been fortunate enough to save, let's say, 100 million Lebanese pounds, it was about $70,000. So, but now it's worth 1,000. So you need to think about that. Am I saying it's definitely going to happen? No, but I have a bad feeling this is what's coming. Now I want to turn to a few clips that I'm going to play here about Lebanon, and they're from Al Jazeera, and I'm going to put a link to the video. It's only a 6-minute report from Beirut, and you see how things are going now. And I actually think it's a positive. Why do I think it's a positive? Well, Rafa Faber always said that a hyperinflation or currency collapse would be good for people because it would be a revulsion versus the currency. And who controls the currency? Well, the central banks and the banks. Is it any wonder they're trying to push us into CBDC? Because I think they see what's happening in Lebanon coming. But look at what this, I think it was the economic minister said.
Lebanon has become a cash economy. It's the result of a 4-year-old financial crisis brought about by decades of mismanagement and corruption. The banking sector is crippled, and the country is close to bankruptcy.
It's the biggest threat that the government and the country is facing, because it is very, very, very dangerous that the entire economy is a cash economy. All the money is going to the private sector.
So there you go. He's concerned that all the money, all the cash is going just to the private economy. Well, I would say that's great. Of course, a lot of people would be hurt if that were to happen here in the UK, in the US, Western Europe. And why is that? Well, because so many people are so dependent on the state, on benefits, on everything, on pensions. So if that were to happen here, it would be very serious. What do I think is the probability of it happening? Well, hopefully it won't happen, but I think it's getting more and more likely. And why do I say that? Well, it's because we've been doing this here in the UK and in the rest of the West. We've been running a very, very loose monetary policy. And the negative real rate here that you see between the Bank of England base rate and the RPI, which I think is a much better measure of the cost of living. We've never seen this before, this negative chasm. Usually the real rate is positive. We're told by economists in the City of London and Wall Street that the real rate now is positive, but that's BS. They're looking at expectations. They're not looking at the real thing. So I think that's one of the reasons why I'm concerned. And the same thing applies for the rest of the West. This profligate policy of inflating, it could come home to roost. The other thing I've found interesting from this video from Al Jazeera is about the protests. Just listen to this guy here being interviewed by this woman in Beirut, and what he said about protesting and asking, demanding reform. Just listen to it.
But we've seen protests like this over the past 4 years, and to no avail. Nothing changes. Why?
Because most of the politicians, they don't have ears to hear, because they don't want to act accordingly, because they are not serious in solving the problem. Most of the rights, it's non-discussable. You don't need anyone to explain these rights, but they don't even in the parliament. They didn't try even to find because they are protecting their own interests.
So yeah, as you can see, they're looking after their own interests. The politicians, the bankers, and you might say, well, it's different in the West, but I don't think so. Who does Boris Johnson, for example, who did he meet back in October of 2021? Well, it says world's top business leaders, but if you look at it, a lot of them were leaders of financial institutions. It says here, those among the elite attending Mr. Johnson's dinner in Downing Street included Stephen Schwarzman, the co-founder of private equity firm Blackstone, Barclays chief Jess Staley. Well, he's the Epstein guy, right? And I don't have to tell you what's happening with JP Morgan and Epstein. That's very serious. Will anything come out of it? It doesn't look like it. Just like that guy said in Beirut, they're going to look after their interests. So that's why what's happening in Beirut and Lebanon is becoming more and more likely to happen here. I hope it doesn't, because it will be hell on earth, I would say. It would be kind of Beirut, Beirut to the power of 10. Anyway, who else have we got? Santander chairman Anna Botin, Larry Fink, head of BlackRock, Goldman Sachs boss David Solomon, JP Morgan's Mr. Diamond. So you can see that the elite here in the West is the same as the elite in Lebanon. As you can see from that article I showed you earlier, Lebanon's once lauded bankers under fire as the economic crisis deepens. And you just have to look at Paris, all the protests there. They're protesting against BlackRock. They protested against the Euronext, which is the Paris Stock Exchange and Derivatives Exchange. They're starting to see that this financialization is only protecting, the financiers and the politicians. And I'm afraid to say they're not going to listen to us. It doesn't look like it. So there you go. That's what could happen. I think, or that's what we need to learn about Lebanon. So yeah, it's years of corruption, really. And we don't use that word much in the West, but it has been years of corruption. We just seen the very wealthy depositors bailed out at SVB Bank and Signature Bank. We don't know whether wealthy depositors in smaller regional banks will be bailed out, because it's up to the corrupt politicians like Janet Yellen and people at the Fed to decide whether you are important enough. So it's becoming just like Lebanon, I'm afraid to say. And what would be the positive here if we were to have a banking and currency collapse in the West? Well, from what we see now in Lebanon, on the ground in Beirut, is that it's become a cash economy. The government has almost no revenues. of course, is going to create a lot of problems. And as I said, hopefully this won't happen, but I just don't see the elites, the political class here in the US or Europe wanting to listen to people. So there you go. That's the message from Lebanon. It could happen here, in my opinion. And I said that back in 2020, and it seems like we're going that way. So with that, I'm going to wish you all a great rest of the weekend. Take care. Bye.